She is clearly a natural-born storyteller, and this novel proves it. I know how excited we all are to hear more about this story from Jeannette. So we are so honored. May we please give Jeannette Walls a warm welcome.
I will not be reading from the Silver Star tonight. I'm hardly Meryl Streep, and I figured y'all know how to read yourselves. You know, with our time together, I'd like to talk with you just a little bit, get a conversation going. And one of the things I want to discuss with you is the incredible journey that I've been on that's brought me here. It gives me such joy to meet readers and talk with you about my story and stories. And it's ironic that it gives me such joy to share my stories, because for most of my life, my story was a source of deep shame for me. I used to write about celebrities for a living, as many of you know. That is not the source of shame. I know it should be. But, you know, my journey really pretty much began the day that I saw my mom on the streets. Oh, it was over a decade ago, and she either gave me permission or challenged me to just tell the truth about my past. And I thought there was no way I could do it. I thought, the story's too weird. Nobody's gonna get it. It's just too bizarre. And beyond that, I was completely convinced that if people knew the truth about me, that I would lose everything. I believed I would get fired from my job, and I'd lose all my friends, and whatever meager little standing I'd carved out for myself in the world. And I think I've learned a lot since having told my story. And one of the things I learned is what a knucklehead I was. But I think I underestimated people. I hugely underestimated people's compassion and their kindness and their willingness to listen to a story as long as I was willing and able to be honest. But I think moreover, I think I underestimated the degree to which pretty much everybody has a story. And I guess it's one of the great gifts that people have given me in exchange for coming clean about my stories. I can't tell you the number of times that people have come up and said, you know, the details of our lives are very different, but you and I have a lot in common. And they start telling me their stories. And sometimes they're crying. And they'll say, oh, I'm so ashamed, I've never told anybody this before. This woman told me one time about being locked in her basement by her mother. And she found a way to sneak out and go to the local library, where the librarian discovered her. She had been reading on nursing, because that was her dream, was to one day be a nurse. So the librarian helped her to get into nursing school. And this woman was telling me this as a professor of nursing. And she said, after having heard you stand up and talk about your story, I think I'm prepared to tell my children my story. They're always asking me questions about it, and always clam up or change the topic. And I said, I think you'll be really surprised about how warm and receptive they are. How old are your children? And she said 31 and 33. So this woman has been walking around with this, what I think is an incredible story of triumph and heroism, and she doesn't know that. I wanted to shake her by the shoulders and say, why would you be ashamed of that story? That's a great story. And over, oh yeah, I was ashamed too. And what I think it points toward is it's the power of storytelling. It's really not about me. It's, you know, when I sat down to tell my story, I thought, why am I doing this? Why am I exposing myself to what I was certain was going to be shame and humiliation? I had everything I ever dreamed of and then some. I had, you know, lived in a fabulous apartment. I could order Chinese food whenever I wanted. I had 3 flush toilets, you know. Anybody who grew up with that flush toilet, I see some nodding going on. Anybody who grew up with a flush toilet knows what a miracle they are. You just move the little handle and, you know, everything disappears. It's wonderful. Why am I, you know, I went on television, discussed important things like Lindsay Lohan and who she's really dating. Why am I risking all of this to tell this embarrassing little story that I've run from for so long? You know, any author who tells you they don't have a fantasy for their story is lying. Because writing is an excruciating process. We all have, well, when this comes out, something will happen, X, Y, Z. And I never dreamed of the bestseller list. I pinch myself daily about how this book has resonated. I never expected that. Or different languages or anything like that. What my fantasy for my story is that one day a rich kid would read it. And by that I mean somebody whose folks paid the bills on time. And I hope that that rich kid would be a little bit nicer to those of us from the wrong side of the tracks. And then as I worked on it a little bit longer, I developed the bolder and more ambitious hope. And that was that somebody who was growing up like me would read it. like I had, and that somebody would get a glimmer of hope the way I got from reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn when I was 10 years old. And like I said, readers have shocked me by their insights, and I thought nobody would understand. Readers understand it better than I do. I was in an event one time, somebody said, "Why did your mom leave Arizona? You had some stability and some security." I said, "You know, I can't get a straight answer from mom, so I don't know for sure." And this woman in the audience raises her hand, and she said, "I know." "How do you know?" She said, "My book club discussed it." So this is why I love doing these events. These people from book clubs all the time come, and I'll never have to go to therapy. I just have to book clubs. It's all been good. But anyway, so this not long after publication, I was approached by this young woman, and she told me that her family had recently been vacationing in the Caribbean. I thought, oh, there's my rich kid, right? And she said that she read my story then, and she said, there's a girl in my class, and she always wears these ugly, out-of-date clothes. And me and all the other cheerleaders always make fun of her. And she said, now I understand, and I will never make fun of her again. And I thought, if the Lord struck me down with lightning right now, that'd be okay with me, because I've done my job on this planet. I had made that one rich kid understand. But then not long after that, I was approached by a young man from northern Alabama, from a rough area. He said, I hate books, and I hate reading, and I don't much like writers, but I enjoyed this book. And I said, wait, if you hate books and don't much like writers, what is it you enjoyed about this? And this young man, he ponders it for a moment, and he said, this here is a fine white trash story. I heard this little gasp, and somebody from behind said, I think that was meant as a compliment. I not only took it as a compliment, I think it's perhaps the greatest compliment I've ever received, because if somebody who thinks of themselves as trash can hear my story and say, hey, you know something, that makes me think of myself and the world a little differently. And if a popular cheerleader can read the same story and say, hey, you know something, that makes me think of myself and others differently. You know, ladies and gentlemen, that is why we tell our stories. You know, I think memoirs get a little bit of a bum rap. People think we're exhibitionists. Oh, these awful things happen to me, you gotta feel sorry for me. But that's not it at all. What we're saying is, this is my life, and maybe you can learn something from it without the nasty business of having to go through it. Yeah. And in my experience, readers are not looking for a freak show. They're not looking to condescend. They're looking to understand. And the amazing thing that I have witnessed, again, I'm not bragging about, well, maybe I am bragging, but I'm not bragging about myself. I'm bragging about the power of storytelling. And I think a lot of us erect these facades and think, oh, I'm not like that person. I would never be like that. But you know, they dress funny and eat funny food or whatever, but you know, we all erect these facades thinking we're protecting ourselves. But what we're doing is we're also isolating ourselves. And what the power of storytelling does is it dissolves those facades and makes people see that behind it, we're all so much alike. And people say, is it weird having everybody know all the details about you? It's the opposite of weird, because I can meet a complete stranger, they think that they know me. Girlfriend, you think you got a weird mama, let me tell you about mine. And we have these intense conversations about all of these things, and I got best friends that I just met 5 minutes ago. But so I thought that was that. I thought that my book would sort of sink like a stone, and I'd go back to the business of writing snarky paragraphs about celebrities, right? Because I just got my one story. So I'm walking the red carpet, and this funny thing starts happening. These celebrities started pulling me off to the side and saying, hey, would you put your microphone down? They said, I just want to thank you for telling your story, because my father's also an alcoholic. And my friends don't understand why I love him. So I bought a couple of copies of your book, and now they understand better. Or my mother's bipolar or whatever, but there were these emotional connections were made. And I thought, dang it, I'll never be able to write anything mean about this person. And so I thought I would lose my job. I thought I'd get fired after I wrote my memoir, but I kind of did lose my job, but not for that reason. I lost it because I believe the truth will set you free, but the truth cannot be condensed to snarky little paragraphs, you know? What is accurate is not necessarily what's true, and I'm not condemning celebrity journalism. I understand celebrities are like Greek gods, and the myths are cultural touchstones, and I understand all that, but I didn't want to do it anymore. What am I going to do? I got nothing left. What am I going to write about? So it was readers who kept coming up and saying, I understand your father, I understand alcoholism, but your mother's a mystery to me. Why would somebody who has a college education, who has the resources to lead a somewhat normal life, why would you choose a life of homelessness and chaos? And so I tell them a little bit about my mother's childhood. And inevitably, their faces would light up and say, your next book needs to be about your mother. And I said, oh, yeah, Ma, I don't want to write about her. But my mother had been homeless when The Glass Castle came out. And a couple of years ago, she wasn't homeless, she was living in an abandoned building without heat or running water. And a couple of years ago, it caught on fire, and she was back on the streets in her 70s. And, you know, I was trying to get her to come live with me. And I no longer live in New York City, I live in rural Virginia. She said, I live in the most exciting city in the world, and you live in the sticks. Why would I want to live with you? I said, because you won't have to sleep on a park bench, Mom. And she said, I'm not a moocher, I'm not some sort of a charity case. And I said, Mom, I'm thinking of getting horses, and I could really use the help. And she said, I'll be right there. And it was such a valuable lesson for me that there's a type of person who puts their sense of independence and self-sufficiency even before they put their own comfort or even their security. And I used to be one of those people. And am I so far removed from my roots that I forgot what it feels like to have somebody come and say, you need my help. But if they say, you could really help me out, I'm there. But so, I wrote the book, it was supposed to be, Half Our Horses, was supposed to be about my mother, ended up being about my grandmother, who was a foul-mouthed, card-playing, hoop-selling, horse-breaking school teacher. And she wasn't just the school teacher, she also drove the school bus, which wasn't a school bus, it was a hearse with the word school bus being on the side. And it was all the time getting stuck in the mud. And she'd make the students get out and recite Hail Marys and push it out of the mud. And she'd say, push and pray, kids, push and pray. And it's become a bit of a philosophy in life for me, push and pray, because I believe in prayer and the power of positive thinking and the power of optimism, but I also believe in the power of pushing. The power of rolling up your sleeves and doing that hard work that needs to be done. But so I wrote a book exploiting myself, I wrote a book exploiting my mom, and I got nothing left to write about. And I've been going around for years saying, I can't make things up. I have no imagination. And people are like, oh, of course you can make things up, you're so creative, you've written these books. But whatever power I have, it's more one of observation than of creating. And I thought, oh, got nothing left to do, I don't know what else. But I sort of thought I was all wrote out. But again, it was readers who kept on saying things like, you should write your next book should be a novel. And they also kept asking me if my mother was mentally ill. And I said, well, of course she's mentally ill, isn't she? And I don't know the answer to that, but it made me fascinated by the whole question of mental illness. And the whole question of creativity. Like, why do people make things up? As somebody who's just sort of always gravitated towards either, as somebody who spent my whole career up until The Glass Castle as a journalist, with quote marks around it, trying to find the truth. Why do people make things up? When Glass Castle first came out, the whole James Fry controversy was sort of breaking. And a lot of people were saying, oh, you must have made stuff up in the Glass Castle. I could have never made that stuff up. Who thinks like that? You know, it's like, who puts their kids in the back of the U-Haul? And I was like, I would not make that stuff. That's embarrassing. Why would I make it up? But then there were people out there who were making things up with these memoirs. Like, why would you do that? If you know, and it just made me really puzzle about people who make things up. Now, people sometimes make things up because they're artists and they're creative. But people sometimes make things up because the world that they live in is not completely the way they want it. So they sort of tart it up a little bit or maybe sand off the sharp edges and create their own reality. And people sometimes make things up because they can't help it and these thoughts appear in their heads. And my family consists of all of the above in varying degrees. And I also come from a highly creative family. When my mother would sit down and give us art lessons and have us all paint pictures of apples, my two sisters, the apples would have fairies floating in and out, and the apples would be melting like Salvador Dali's and all that. My apples look like apples. And I'm fascinated by this propensity. Why do people make things up? And so that's something that I sat down, I just started reading obsessively about mental illness, and I became fascinated about the relationship between what we call mental illness and creativity. If you look at the number of people who are creative geniuses who've been posthumously diagnosed as being bipolar, it's pretty much a who's who. People whose minds go places that my mind doesn't. It's almost the definition of genius. And why is that? And why do some people just have this ability to, their minds go elsewhere? Again, my family's filled with them, and I'm not one of them. I'm also fascinated by the whole, when children take over responsibilities that when their parents are absent, what happens? For obvious reasons I'm fascinated by it. It's something I deal with in a great deal in The Silver Star. And time again, not just in my life, but with with people sharing their stories with me, which has just been such a gift. I hear about absent parents who are either physically or emotionally or intellectually absent, and the children take on adult responsibilities, and very often it's the oldest child. And the oldest child becomes the parent so that the siblings can still be children, and it's genuinely heroic when that happens. And a very disproportionate number of CEOs were firstborn children, because you learn astonishing abilities to delegate and to be an adult at a very early age. But sometimes that burden is just too much for the oldest child, and the child comes out damaged. And from there I was sort of wondering, why is it that some children go through the same circumstance, and one comes out okay, and the other comes out sort of not okay. And I was at this wonderful event, sort of like this in Vancouver just the other day, and a woman was telling me about it, a doctor a psychologist who puts people in two categories. One are dandelions, and the other are orchids. And the orchids are, they're beautiful flowers, and in the right environment, they thrive and just do magnificent things, but they need that very specific environment. And then there are the dandelions, and they can grow anywhere. We can just grow up right out of the cement, we can grow in the desert, we can grow in the tundra, and it's an interesting question, again, that I've been chewing on for so long because so many people have asked me this. And so I cranked out The Silver Star. It is the first novel that I wrote that started out as a novel. I called Half Broke Horses a novel because most of it's from my mom, and I have no idea how much is true. People say, well, how much did you make of it? It's sort of not like that. I've heard Mom would tell me things, I believe this is what happened, and to my best of my understanding, this is what happened. But it's not like I went and made it all up. I just cobbled things together. The Silver Star is also, it's largely observed. It's things that I've witnessed and cobbled together, and it's composites of composites. And I came to realize that the writers whose work I've enjoyed throughout most of my life the fiction writers are actually very close to nonfiction. If you look at Hemingway or John Updike or John Cheever. I mean, John Cheever's daughter would always tell her friends, "Don't say anything interesting around Dad, or he'll steal it." You know, and so you know that is largely what I did in The Silver Star. I sort of stole things that I witnessed, and when something was bewildering to me, and the difference between fiction and nonfiction, it's been very interesting to me, because with nonfiction, you just keep asking yourself, what really happened? What really happened? With nonfiction, what would happen? With fiction, what would happen? And the place I would turn with instances that I knew, examples that I knew, and the challenge becomes cobbling together something that is cohesive and believable. Some people have said that The Silver Star is actually much more believable than The Glass Castle. So I find that reassuring. You know, it's funny. I used to think that the way to feel good about yourself was to feel superior to other people. And I'll tell you a real quick story about myself, and I'll throw it open for questions. But for some reason, I was just reminded of this. I'd been living in New York City for a couple of years, and I thought it was pretty hot because I went out to fancy restaurants and wore designer clothes and all that. And I decided to go back to a little town in West Virginia where I'd grown up, where I was the poorest of the poor, and show those hicks a thing or two about what a sophisticated New Yorker I'd become, as y'all can tell from my sophisticated accent. So I went down there, and I decided to have dinner at this restaurant that I'd always been sort of too intimidated to eat at. And it was a coffee shop, which everything is relative. So I put my best clothes, and I sashayed in, and the waitress hands me a menu, and I put it up and said, "Special today, fish." I knew from having eaten at fancy New York restaurants, you know how the waiter comes over and he says, "Oh yes, the special today is a lovely Chilean sea bass with caramelized crust." And so the waitress comes over, she said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Yes, what is the fish?" Now I was being a jerk, because I knew darn good and well what the fish was. It wasn't some lovely Chilean sea bass with caramelized crust. It was a little square piece of fish with breadcrumbs. It was basically fish sticks, which happens to be my favorite fish anyway. So I was being a jerk by asking her and trying to humiliate her to say, "This is not a fancy restaurant like you're obviously used to eating at," so that I might feel superior to her. So she said, "Oh," and I said, "What is the fish?" She said, "Excuse me?" And I said, "The menu says special today fish. What is the fish?" And she looks at me to see if she heard what I just asked her, and then she looks around to see if anybody else heard what I just asked her, and then she says, sort of slow and careful so I can understand her, you know, The fish is an animal that swims in the water. So here I am trying to be a snob, and she's thinking, make them pretty dumb or you can run like But if I would have succeeded, the only thing I would have succeeded in doing is making her feel bad about herself. And if I wanted to, you know, and I wouldn't have felt any better about myself. If I wanted to feel better about myself, I should have introduced myself, and maybe I would have made a friend, but I didn't understand all that. I didn't understand it. You know, it's taken me all this time to understand that it's not about feeling better or superior to anybody else. It's making that emotional connection. I've also come to believe that those of us, you know, that so many of us are walking around with shame, with things that we're ashamed of, that we think is wrong with us. And it's so ironic to me, because I think that so many people have said, oh, you're so strong, you're so resilient, I could have never gone through what you did. And I'm flattered, but it's nonsense. Of course you could. I just had the blessing of having a crappy childhood, so I know I could. But then people who've gone through these things think that something's wrong with you because you went through them. We internalize these things and carry around this guilt and this shame. And I've come to the conclusion that, like everything in life, is both a blessing and a curse. And it's entirely up to you which one you choose to focus on. And I've also come to believe that that these things that we like the least about ourselves are the best thing we have going for us. If we can, and I use this line in the Silver Star because I definitely believe if you can shine your light in those dark places, that is where you find your treasures. But it takes a while. It takes a while to sort of know that because we walk around with these misconceptions, and again, I go back to the power of storytelling, that sometimes it's easiest to see yourself through other people's eyes, and once you start sharing the stories, that's when the magic happens. And for me, it was come to terms with my past, with my mom. And it's so ironic to me that this person who I was so ashamed of for so long and just didn't want to acknowledge in public was not only, you know, the source for my most recent book, not this one, but the other day I was getting into this argument with her, and it got a little rough. My mother's a hoarder. I didn't realize that when I was growing up because our houses were always burning down. Now that she's lived in our place for a couple of years, she hoards things, and I got into an argument because I don't want to get too gross on you, but there were maggots on the coffee table. I'm like, Mom, no maggots. And she said, I'll live life the way I choose to, Jeannette. And I said, fine, go down and live in New York, but not here. And she said, you're kicking me out. I said, oh no, don't pull that on me. I'm not kicking you out, but there are rules here. And it got sort of ugly, and she started crying. My husband came and I said, oh, come for Mom, I upset her. And then I went and apologized. I said, Mom, I'm really sorry. I can be so rough. I can be hard. And she said, don't ever apologize for who you are. And I said, yeah, but I got an ugly mouth on me. And she said, and that ugly mouth has gotten you far. What a great line is that? So I stole it and I put it in the book. So even though this is labeled fiction, I think those of you familiar with my previous will notice some repeating themes. With that, I'd like to throw it out for questions. And feel free to ask absolutely anything. You can tell I'm pretty much impossible to embarrass them. If I don't know the answer, maybe somebody's book club here does. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. My question is, you said earlier, sometimes people come out broken, sometimes they come out whole, right? And I got from your book that, because there was a humor laced through it, the sense of humor was really amazing book, that you, although you didn't have certain things, you had a love in the family that kept you.
I think it goes right back to that, the love. If you feel loved and valued, that, you know, and I also put in with that a love of education. I think the two go hand in hand. If you get those two things, I think you can make it through just about anything. Ideally, you get food and clothing as well, I'll acknowledge that. But originally, I wanted to write a little bit more about my New York years and my first husband's circles and just the incredible unhappiness and misery and people suing other people over trust funds. But it felt sort of like I was making fun of that world. And it's you know, we poor folk have not cornered the market on suffering. It felt like I was nanny diaries or something, just sort of trying to make fun of rich people, and let rich people write about their misery and I'll write about mine. And so I wasn't looking out to make fun of me, but I completely agree with you. I think that I'm one of the luckiest human beings in the world, and that I had many wonderful gifts from my childhood. That being said, there's no amount of money you can pay me to relive it. Yes,
I hope this is not too touchy. I understand you're being ashamed of the way you grew up. I don't understand how you got past anger, especially when it comes to.
How could that possibly be too touchy? My goodness, no, I don't think it's too touchy at all. No, this is what these conversations are all about. You know, anger. It's not that I'm a good person; it's that I'm a pragmatist. Somebody asked Nelson Mandela why isn't angrier, and he said, if I thought it would do any good, I would. But the thing is, when you're anger and bitterness, it doesn't do anything for the person you're angry or bitter with, but it eats you up inside. And as long as you're angry with somebody, they are still controlling you. Very early on in life, I realized I'm not going to get these things from my parents, especially my mom. It's just not there. It's like trying to milk a cow and hoping you're going to get wine. It's just not going to happen. And if you just sit there like, come on, wine, it's just, you're going to like, it's not going to happen. If you can let go of that and move on. And it's not even a matter of forgiveness, because I can't forgive Mom for what she's, it's acceptance. It's not forgiveness. Acceptance doesn't mean approval. I mean, my mother can't take care of herself. How could she take care of me? How can I say, Mom, I forgive you for being a damaged person? It's who she is, it's what she can do. And I think once you can accept that, then is when you let go. As long as you're angry, you're still a prisoner to that, and you're stuck. I believe that she also gave me incredible gifts. It's really interesting. I was in an event one time, and people were debating whether or not I had a good mom. And it's really, I go to like universities and people like theme papers, term papers on it. But and neither perspective is right or wrong. My brother, who I adore, one time had a very long, painful conversation with my mother, trying to get her to apologize for the way we were raised. And said, Brian, it's not going to happen. She sees herself as a victim as well, and in a certain way she is. But see, the reason I don't even think it's forgiveness is I don't see myself as a victim. To say, Mom, I forgive you. I don't see it that way. I think I'm very lucky. I think there were incredible gifts she gave me.
What about your father? I'm still mad at your father.
My father was an alcoholic, and anyone who's ever loved an alcoholic knows how, like, they will break your heart, and they put it back together, and they will break it again. You can't help them unless they want to help themselves. I adored my father. I wish he were still around. In my wise old age at 53, I would cure him and get him to stop drinking. There's nothing I can do to fix him. As much as I loved him, I believe he loved me. I also believe he was deeply damaged. And how can you be angry with somebody for having been damaged? My father was drinking heavily by the time he was 13. How can you forgive somebody for being that damaged? He gave me what he could. And I think he gave me incredible treasures. But I'll tell you, it's really interesting. My fondest memory from my entire childhood is when I was 5 years old, and we had no money for Christmas presents. And my dad gave each of us a star. And I have never been a terribly subtle creature, chose the brightest one. Dad explained to me it wasn't a star at all, it was Venus, just a planet. I said I wanted it anyway. Dad said, what the hell is Christmas? You want a planet? You got a planet. He gave it to me. And I treasure that gift. I treasure that story so much. I see Venus up in the sky and think, I own that, honey, that is mine. I told that story at my father's funeral. My older sister Lori, who's a lot smarter than me and always saw right through my father's BS and still has not forgiven him, folds her arms and at his funeral said, isn't that like that sorry SOB dad of ours to go give away something that doesn't belong to him in first place? And I thought about that comment for a while I was writing my book, because I'm an optimist and I see things that way. Lori's absolutely right. Dad's giving me Venus was a completely meaningless gesture. Even worse, it was one of his slicker ways of giving us a present without having to buy us anything. And I'm right too. It's a priceless treasure. So it is whatever you choose to make of it. And that's the funny thing about even with nonfiction. We shape our truths by which stories we tell and how we choose to tell them. And if any of my siblings had written A Glass Castle, it would have been an entirely different story without any of the facts necessarily being different. It's what you choose to focus on. And I believe it's a choice. I do believe that. You know, that being said, you know, do I whitewash stuff too much? Am I in denial? You know, I don't know. And this is the sort of thing that you ask yourself, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, where do you choose to go and how you choose to tell your story? Thank you. Yes.
It sounds like you have a good relationship with your siblings.
Yes, I do.
Do your siblings have a relationship with your mother and their mother?
They have a relationship. I don't know if I call it good. My older sister's very close to my mother. They're artists and they talk about art stuff all the time. My brother has it a little. The former cop sees things a little bit more black and white and right and wrong. He said becoming a parent made him less sympathetic to mom and dad. Brian is the only one of us who became a parent. I think the fact that there's 3 children and none of us, 3 girls and none of us had. I don't think that's coincidence. I love kids and I always thought I would have them, but I never had an overwhelming drive to have children. It's sort of like, there's something called parented children, and when you take on adult responsibilities as a child, you're less inclined. So, been there, done that. You know, and I love kids. It would have been a mistake to have had them with my first husband. But I never had this overwhelming desire, like I must have children, I must have children. But Brian said becoming a parent made him less sympathetic to mom and dad. He said it's not that hard to feed your kids. He said becoming a teacher, after he retired from being a cop, he became a teacher. He said it made him appreciate mom and dad more. He said what some of those kids were not given by their parents. He's in a rough area in Brooklyn. What some of those kids were not given by their parents was staggering to him. And, you know, again, it's what you choose to focus on. And my kid's sister, she's an orchid, what can I say? She's a little damaged. But she's okay. She's living in a clean, safe place. And I'm trying to get her to come live with me in Virginia. She says she never wants to live where it's cold ever again. And I think it'll be a problem, me putting her and mom in the same vicinity. But Brian says she never wants to live where it's cold ever again. I told her, the cold's not so bad when you got a thermostat. Just move a little and it gets warm. She said, I almost froze to death. And so did I, but that's one of the reasons I love the winter, because you can get warm whenever you want. It's a miracle. So I might have to accept that she will never take me up on my offer, but I'm not giving up yet. I'm going to tell her I'm thinking of getting chickens so I could really use her help. So.
Some of us a really long time to learn that you can't go to the hardware store for bread. So how did you figure that out?
Just very early on, you just sort of, it's a different set of rules, and you just adjust way early on. And you know, I try to remember exactly when I realized we were different from other kids. And people pointed at us a lot, and I don't think it was out of admiration. Despite what Dad said. It's just something you come to accept real early on. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, you're talking about your relationship with your siblings, but how did they feel initially about the book?
I told everybody that I was writing it. My older sister was sort of like, oh, go ahead. You know, she doesn't sort of roll her eyes. She finds the past a little more painful than I do. I didn't have my kid sister's permission, but since the book came out, we've gotten back in touch, and she's fine with it. My brother was fabulous from day one. He's got this still track memory, and I run everything by him. They were all fine with it. If anything, I think it's brought us all closer. Mom was a little upset with my description of her driving.
That's the only part?
Other than that, she's pretty much okay with it. She said, I see the world differently than you do, but I understand why you see it the way you do, and I understand why you have to write the truth as you saw it. And I think it's pretty fabulous. Mom she's an interesting woman. She sees things differently than most people do. These stupid carpenter bees were flying around our head the other day, and I was thinking I gotta get some poison and kill these stupid carpenter bees, and Mom saw me watching them and said, aren't they wonderful? They're so friendly. It's kind of like having pets you don't need to feed. She sees the world differently. Is that insane, or is it just gloomy as all get out? Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
How did you know that you were loved as a woman growing up?
How did I know that I was loved growing up? My dad just made me feel like the center of the universe. I never asked him a question. He not only didn't answer, but he would spend time with it. One of these debates where I was doing an event, people were arguing whether or not I had good parents, whether or not I was an abused or neglected child. Most people were strongly in the category of that I had a terrible childhood and I'm in denial about how awful it was. But the person who was most voraciously defending me was somebody who was born and raised on Fifth Avenue. Her mother was a socialite, her father was a wealthy industrialist. And she said, if my father had one time taken us kids out and discussed the stars with us, or if my mother had one time said, don't ever apologize for who you are, be yourself, she said, I would not be in therapy today. So I think that for all they didn't do, they give me incredible gifts. And, you know, people say, why aren't you angry? Why aren't you big? Look at me, I have an incredible life. You should see the hotel they put me up at. I got flush toilets. I am so lucky. And if you are where you want to be, why regret how you got there? I was given the tools to get where I am today. And that, you know, what do I have to be bitter or angry about? My gosh, I have everything I've ever dreamed of. And somebody said, are the results of this book a dream come true for you? I'd have to be a little nutty to dream this. Oh yeah, I want to stay on the bestseller list for 6 years. I mean, you know, and I've got to tell you, the thing that moves me the most is the number of people who tell me that it's helped them reassess. And that's what it's all about. It's not about the bestseller list. It's about the freedom that it's given me and the emotional connection that it's allowed me to make. I used to see the world. I was so prepared to be met with contempt and ridicule. I saw the world as a place filled with potential enemies. And anybody looked cross-eyed at me. And one of the blessings of my childhood is that I'm a fighter and a scrapper. And one of the curses of my childhood is that I'm a fighter and a scrapper. And somebody looks cross-eyed at me, I'll kick their butt, man, because I'm not afraid of anything. And I was completely prepared to have to kick everybody's butt once my story came out. And instead, I was greeted with love and kindness. And it was transformative for me. And now the world is no longer a place filled with potential enemies, but rather a place filled with potential friends. And that's huge. And I think that most people, if they're willing to let down their defenses, will find that. And anybody who doesn't greet you with warmth and kindness and compassion, you don't want them as a friend anyway. Other questions? Yes, sir. Yes.
I'm listening, I read your book, and I'm looking at, you had a disproportionate amount of adversity in your life.
Yes.
As I'm listening to you now, I'm projecting my own sense of my Buddhist path. Because I'm hearing a lot of very spiritual equanimity is what I'm thinking. So along the way, did you have any kind of spiritual anchor or something that to be not angry, to be accepting of how things work?
You know, I've always been a spiritual and religious person. I've never for one second doubted the existence of God or an afterlife. It's just, it doesn't make, but if you've read my book, you know my unpleasant experiences in the Catholic Church when Dad came. So I've not been a big churchgoer until fairly recently. But I'm a deeply religious person, and I think the more you learn about, and I definitely am one of the people who believe that science and religion not only can coexist, that they reinforce each other. So, but yes, the answer is yes. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, just shift the conversation a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about when you were approaching to write The Glass Castle? Because you started off tonight by saying I was completely embarrassed by my story. I would never tell anybody my story. But then now you shift into writer mode where you're going to start writing the story down on paper. So was your approach that you'll just put everything down without picking and choosing?
That's an excellent question. Did you all hear that? Should I repeat this? The question is when I shifted into writer mode, from going to I don't want to tell anybody this story, to I'm going to tell it down. What was the process?
Well, yeah, that you're embarrassed about your story. So then when you're about to write it, what's the approach? Are you just going to write everything down and not be a writer? Or are you going to pick and choose and you know that when you put this story in next to this story, the house sliding down the hill and picking food out of
Excellent question. So the question is, once I decided to go into writer mode, what was my process? Did I write everything down, or did I pick and choose and be very writerly about it, which is such a good question. I actually did, even though I said I didn't want to tell him, but I did try to write it a couple of times earlier. And these bursts of 200 or 300 pages, not just orally. And I tried to fictionalize it one time, and I couldn't figure out what the heck I was supposed to change. What was I supposed to change? Was the mafia really after Dad? What should be the plot twist? Everything was so weird to fictionalize. It would have been weirder. So I couldn't even think fake names for us all. But so when I finally did sit down, and there were a number of things that sort of gave me a big kick in the behind to do it. One was my husband was wonderful about it, and the Church of Scientology was investigating me at one point, and I thought, like, I have nothing to hide. Oh yeah, actually I do. And it was an outrage. They can't look into me. And I was, well, of course they can. If I can look into them, they can look into me. But anyway, when I sat down to write it, it's an excellent question. I wrote the first version in 6 weeks. I am a very fast but sloppy writer. But my bad writing default mode is this very stilted journalism. I heretofore not considered a plethora of influences. And my agent read it, and she said, you wrote this as though it happened to somebody else. You have to describe what happened and how you felt about it. And I didn't know what the story was when I first sat down to write it. I was a specialist in the short, snarky paragraph. I wasn't really sort of thinking in the larger architectural thing. So I spent 5 years rewriting it. And that 5 years was trying to be honest. And I don't mean, I wasn't, in earlier versions, trying to pass myself off as a Rockefeller. It was being honest. And a big part of that honesty is finding your voice. I found that I couldn't read other books while I was working on it. I was reading Frank McCourt, Angela's Ashes at one point while I was working on it. And I was reading back an early version, and this Blarney had crept in, and it's like, my reading with your brother, and it's like, I don't talk like this. So part of the challenge and part of being honest is finding your voice. And I found whenever I was writing it as an adult, looking back, I would lapse into this armchair psychoanalyzing. And to most honestly say, well, what it felt like, I felt it was most effective to write it as a child. That being said, I thought the New York years would be played much more prominently than they did. I think you don't know what you know until you write it. That's just my writing style. And what is the story? What is the story? I have all these wacky relatives who didn't get written in. They all ended up on the cutting room floor. The pieces of the puzzle are sort of floating around in your head. I was shocked the first time I read it back. I think we all know things that we don't realize we know. It's like, dang, so look at things happen to me. And so you have to sort of, and then there's the whole question of tone. And there were a couple of scenes that I found very difficult to write. I showed an early version to my husband. He said, Jeannette, if your parents weren't buying food for you, how did you survive? I said, I got by. He said, what do you mean you got by? I said, I'm pretty resourceful, you know. And he said, no, I don't know. You have to spell that out. There is no way I'm writing down about digging around in the garbage, because it was very, well, it was embarrassing. That's why I say shine the light in the dark areas, because it was those most embarrassing, horrifying things that probably packed the most punch. But I did not want to talk about that. And when I wrote that scene, I must have had to have written it 20 times, and I was crying. And we're not talking pretty Hollywood tears, we're talking red nose, snot slinging, you know, over tears. I was a mess. But a very wise man once said to me, he said, secrets are a little bit like vampires. They suck the life out of you, but they can exist only in the darkness. Once they're exposed to light, there's a moment of horror, but then poof, they lose their power over you. And I've just found that to be true, yeah.
Yeah, what I love about when you're taking the food out of the garbage at the high school, it's not just taking the food out of the garbage, and you know, because we can all do that if we're starving, but the strategies that you came up with to set it up so it seemed, it was safe. It's been a while since.
Thank you. Yeah. I had to hide in the stall. Yeah, I had to hide in the stall and pull up my feet so that nobody would recognize my shabby old shoes. And again, this is one of the reasons I'm so drawn to nonfiction or fiction that closely resembles nonfiction, is because, you know, when John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath, it didn't come out of his head. He went and talked to people, because it's those telling details like that make things feel true. That, oh my gosh, this feels lived. And you have to go back through those painful periods and capture them and put them down. And then people say, oh, this is real. This feels like something that somebody went through. And you're sharing the experience. But next.
I had a second question.
Yeah,
Sorry. Who chose to put that first scene at the very first couple of pages? Was it your editor or you?
Who chose to put the first scene? You mean Sing Mom? That was me. That was my decision. There was just no question that I was going to open up with that, because it was such an impetus for me to go ahead and tell the story. It was my husband who suggested opening up with the burn scene. And I said, that was no big deal, because, you know, I still got scars and stuff like that, but it's not like it really interfered with my life. I couldn't wear halter tops or anything like that. It's no big deal. He said, it's a big deal, trust me. And he said, this scene's going to depend on detail. Write down absolutely everything you remember about that scene. I was like, okay, I'm going to type it all over. And he looks at me and he said, you can take some of this detail out. I just feel this, because people always ask me, how can you remember all this stuff from your life when you're only 3? Brain scientists will tell you that traumatic memories are stored in a certain part of the brain, where they're more easily recalled for evolutionary reasons. You know, that's why so many people remember exactly what they were doing when Kennedy was shot. Or, and so, actually, let's do a show of hands. How many people here remember something from when they were 3? A good chunk. And keep your hand up if it was a traumatic memory. So there you go. So people have asked me, you must have made some of that stuff up. No, I didn't make anything up. But you have to go back and relive it. You have to go back and search and try to be true. And people say, how much are memoirs allowed to make up? You don't make anything up. Once you start making stuff up, you call it fiction. Because the whole point of telling your stories is to get into those true moments. And I'm not above, I respect fiction, and that's why I went ahead and made the leap with Half-Broke Horses. And my hope for the Silver Star is that I'll be able to hit at some of those same truths. My hope is that, that people say, yeah, I remember stuff like that happened to me, or that the dilemmas that they face will elicit the same sort of recognition and conversation. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
It's such a relief to hear that it took 5 years, and it's also such a relief to hear that you have a successful marriage. Like, that's fantastic.
Oh,
I bought your book 3 times. I gave away each copy, so the only copy I sort of stole from my aunt and uncle. I can't give it away because it's not mine. I just love your book. I wanted to know if you are all, I'm really excited about this next one too. I wanted to know if you went to school for writing before the Glass Castle.
The question is, did I go to school for writing before the Glass Castle? No, the journalism background was really, it served me very well, even though this sort of writing is very, very, very different. And it would take me, when I sit down to work on any of these books, I had to get into what I would call bookhead. Because it's a very different thing. You've got to sort of, it would take me a while to be thinking in that voice and that deeply. I mean, I can toss off a paragraph in seconds flat if it's for my column, but it's a different way of writing, and different writers will tell you different things. As I said, 5 years, and I just kept on rewriting and rewriting. I think it was Yeats who said, if it seems more than a moment's thought, all your stitching and unstitching is for naught. Which is to say that, like, you gotta work really hard for it to seem spontaneous, So that's why, I spent a lot of time on that. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. You were saying every family member would write your book differently?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're the middle?
I am the middle. Well, it's second after before.
Right, I'm like kind of the middle, but do you think that skewed your view of the world when you protected? I'm in the middle of 6.
The question is sort of birth order, and what was my being the second before, did that influence my perspective? Was I protected? I think absolutely. I mean, some really interesting studies have been done about birth order, and I read a couple of college papers about the birth order of the Walls kids, and how they took on the various roles. So you should talk to them, not me. They're the experts. Yes.
So I have another writerly question. And that is, was it easy for you to get an agent, or did you have to build a big platform first? What was that process?
The question is regarding getting an agent, and was it easy to get? When I had I was in journalism beforehand. I knew a bunch of people in the media, and I already had an agent for what is actually my first book, which we don't discuss in polite company. It was about celebrities and the celebrity business, and I thought it was going to sell like hotcakes, and it sunk like a stone. It just did nothing. And I thought the Glass Castle would sink like a stone. So a Jewish friend of mine says the Talmud has a line: when the heart speaks, the heart listens. And so if you're thinking of writing, write it from the heart, because readers are so smart and they can tell when you're faking it. But regarding an agent, I highly recommend, if you're going to try to get published commercially, to get an agent. That being said, there are so many other avenues to try to get work published these days. There's self-publishing, which used to just be this sort of weird thing off to the side, but has become very active and quite reputable. And there's also just putting it on the internet. The important thing is getting your story out there. I think it's less important about, how it's marketed than just telling the story. If it's something that you're considering doing, fiction, nonfiction, memoirs, biographies, whatever, just tell the story and get it out. But if you want it published commercially, you probably need an agent. If you want to talk afterwards, I have a name of a good one who I can give you. Yes?
I just want to ask about Lily Casey. I love both the books, and a lot of times when I've probably read them both about 6 times, and when I'm reading Half-Broke Horses, I often go back to the little bits of Lily Casey that you mentioned in The Glass Castle. And I'm just wondering, because you said that you had to kind of put the story together based on information your mom gave you, but you also said that you felt a real strong connection to her. And so I almost feel like it's you living her when I'm reading that story. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. I hope you all heard that, because I don't think I can repeat it as many times as she did. It makes absolute sense to me. I feel Lily Casey Smith had a very strong influence on me. I just remember our cars always made a lot of noise, and so when we drove down the street, people would like sort of stick their heads out to see who was coming. And I just remember when we went to the neighborhoods where my grandmother lived, and it was just always this big to-do, but I just adored her. And she was a very strong influence on me. And I remember her conversations, I remember her combing my hair, I remember her being in her car one time, and she had a car that had these little green lights that blinked in the direction you wanted to go. I just never seen anything so miraculous. Wow, that is so fancy. You know? And I originally tried to write Half-Broke Horses in my mother's voice. And it felt like I was mimicking her, like making fun of her voice. So I tried it in Lily's voice, and it just came to me. I was like, and Mom would always told me, "You're just like my mother." And she didn't mean it as a compliment, but I do think that she and I share a lot, my grandmother and I. Yes, you have a question?
Yes, when you sat down to physically write The Glass Castle, was your primary motivation to remove the burden of your story, with the motivation of others being a secondary, not unintended consequence?
Excellent question. Did y'all hear that? Yes. Actually, yes, that was my primary motivation, was just to tell the story, to stop walking around with this burden and being ashamed and thinking that if people knew me, they wouldn't like me. And the rest was a big bonus and largely unsuspected. But I did hope that a couple of people would recognize something, like I said, that I did with Tree Girls in Brooklyn. So yes, the answer is yes. Other questions? Okay, I think we're ready to start signing then. Thank you all so very much.